Welcome to the Modern German Identity podcast. You are listening to Part 1, Division and Reunification. Today's guests are Dr. Martin Yonder, who is a professor of German history at the Freie Universität Berlin, and Dr. Dirk Verheyen, who is a professor of political science also at the Freie Universität Berlin.
Germany has gone through a lot in the past 75 years following Nazi rule. Post-war policies and divided territories redefined what the future of the German nation-state would look like. This period saw changes in a younger generation looking for new ways to cope with Germany's painful past. Establishments of Cold War divisions also shaped this forming identity of what it meant to be a modern German. Finally, the fight for German reunification in the 1990s and the establishment of the modern German border once again redefined Germanism as the country reunited and reformed its new identity. These events of division, past remembrance, and reunification shifted German identity and contributed to the development of Germany today as a new world power. After the surrender of Germany in 1945, the country was divided up into 4 occupation zones, each occupied by one of the victorious 4 states: Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Berlin was also divided 4 ways, even though it was located in the center of Soviet territory. Land in the former Prussia was given to Poland in order to weaken German economic power. In 1945, the 2 policies of the Allies were denazification and democratization. Both of these policies were designed to help create a more democratic Germany. Some of these processes included the Nuremberg trials, which prosecuted several high-level Nazi officials and had 12 subsequent trials after. Allied-imposed denazification was relatively unsuccessful, however, because it mainly targeted specific Nazis for prosecution and did not address the racial ideologies that still existed within the German public. The second task of democratization would rely more on economic principles and rebuilding a stable, healthy economy than forging close economic and military ties to the West. This idea of German economic growth and democratization pushed the process of denazification to the back burner, while the Western powers prepared for the Cold War. In 1949, the 3 Western allies of Britain, France, and the U.S. combined their occupied zones to create the Federal Republic of Germany, which received sovereign status in 1955. Bonn was made the capital of the new Federal Republic, with Konrad Adenauer of the Christian Democratic Union, or CDU, as its first chancellor. During his time as chancellor, West Germany had strengthened its commitment to liberal democracy. Successful consolidation of West German democracy relied mainly on the idea of extraordinarily fast economic growth that occurred mostly thanks to U.S. aid. This economic miracle would radically improve the lives of Germans in the area and provided confidence in the German system. Aid mainly came from the U.S. in the form of the Marshall Plan in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The goal was to restart the economy, which in turn would allow Germany to be able to pay off its war reparations more effectively, as opposed to what had happened earlier with the very high reparations from the Versailles Treaty in World War I. This push to revamp the economy of Germany came from the idea that the faster West Germany gained its economic structure back, the better the Western powers would fare in the Cold War against the Soviet bloc, which was being consolidated in the East. The search for what it meant to be German took on many forms. Westernization and democratization through the economic miracle provided the first drastic change in German life. The second would come in the form of the younger generation looking back on the difficult past and trying to make amends. The Germans called this Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past. Publicly, the German government under Adenauer has taken a hard stance against the crimes committed during the Holocaust. He worked hard throughout this time as chancellor to establish the legitimacy of the State of Israel, which included paying them reparations. After his departure from office in 1963, the new generation of young Germans took it over. These Germans were born directly following the war and by the 1960s had reached college age. They were beginning to spearfront campaigns to Germany to cope with its past.
Well, my grandfather is a famous man. It means especially students of chemistry, they have to read his books today because he was a very important chemist, was born before the First World War, and after the end of the First World War, more or less became a fan of Hitler. He participated in the march in Munich in the year 1923 when Hitler, for the first time, wanted to destroy the German democracy. And he was a gas war researcher. And he made his career, and one of his brothers formed the SA. This was, so to say, the military arm of Hitler's party in Göttingen. And my grandfather made his career, and in 1933 he became the head of a very important research institution of Germany, the Kaiser Wilhelm Chemistry Institute in the city of Berlin. And the first thing that he did was kicking out all the Jews that were working in this institute. This was a story which was never told at home. My parents did not mention that story. I loved this man. He was my, so to say, my special friend. He lived in Berlin. I often met him when I was a kid. He died when I was 6 years old. When I was 6 years old, I did not know about his story. I learned about that story when I was a student of history, and it was a shock to me because I could not think that anyone of my family had been a fan of Hitler and had been a member of his party and had been a real anti-Semite, kicking out all the Jews out of their jobs and all these things. So it was a deep shock. And I think it was maybe one of the important points why I became a historian. I learned this story when I was more or less 30 years old, so lately in my after I had become a student of history. So there are other reasons for why I became a fan of history too. But my grandfather and what he did and how that can be, that an adult person becomes a fan of Hitler and is participating in his politics and crimes. That was a deep shock. But it opened my eyes for many things I did not want to see and hear before.
The Auschwitz trials were held in Frankfurt from 1963 to 1968 and showed the beginnings of Germany's own commitment to its future denazification programs. These trials tried members of the SS and leadership who contributed to the Auschwitz concentration camp. It showed a major step in German recognition of Nazi crimes. Polls did show that the majority of the German public opinion was against the trials. However, this was mostly taking into account the older generations of Germans who had grown up with and supported Nazi rule. The denazification process did little to change the minds of this generation of Germans. The important note here, however, is that the younger generation that had not originally supported the Nazis began to advocate for Germany to try its war criminals, pay reparations, and move forward from their past. Another movement was in the German school system, starting in the 1960s. One source said that the real push to teach the Holocaust in German schools began in the early 1960s, after a rash of anti-Semitic graffiti prompted politicians to supplement the social science curriculum with materials combating the cultivation of fascist and undemocratic sentiments. The older generation of Germans resisted the process of denazification in the years immediately following the war. However, the new generation of Germans that began to come of age during the economic miracle found a new role for Germany, and that meant denouncing the past and working to make amends. This idea of self-imposed denazification would play a major role in the foundation of a new German identity that would be based upon being an arbitrator of peace and freedom in future generations.
I think it's very good that you point out the difference between what the Allies insisted in terms of denazification with the Nuremberg trials, of course, being the peak of the whole thing, versus what Germans were expected to do themselves. Because in many ways, the Adenauer years, for example, in Western Germany, were in that regard rather quiet years. There was a tendency to say we have the urgency of the Cold War and of rebuilding and reconstruction after the war. So let's not really deal with the past. It's uncomfortable. Let's just not get into it. And so there were plenty of folks, even those who have no personal culpability. They haven't done anything, but they just simply wanted to move on. It was too much trauma. And there was a sense, maybe it was even an excuse, to say it's the Cold War, it's rebuilding, reconstruction, let's move on, In the eastern part of the country, there was a tendency to say, officially at least, and a lot of people started buying into this, that Nazism was a product of capitalism and of the evil West. And since we now in the East have become socialist or communist, we were really the victims because we were in the resistance to the Nazis, which of course was really a false argument because it really was not historically correct, but it was the official ideological line. So for different reasons, for much of the post-war period, this was, initially at least, not a big issue that people wanted to address. And then we're back to generations. You get to the 1960s, and a younger generation comes and starts saying, hey, Grandpa, what did you do during the war? Where were you? Were you on the Eastern Front? Were you in the SS? Whatever, These questions were suddenly asked by a younger generation. So we're back again to the importance of generations when you're trying to get a sense of contemporary Germany.
As economic conditions worsened in East Germany, more and more people began fleeing west in search of jobs brought on by the economic miracle. The Soviets, who relied on the raw material output from East Germany, did not like that so many people were escaping over the border, especially to West Berlin, which existed right in the middle of East Germany. In 1961, a wall was built that completely surrounded West Berlin and prevented East German citizens from crossing the border. Not only was the wall constructed overnight, but it was also heavily militarized. There was a space between two sets of walls that became known as the Death Strip. Within that strip stood guards and armed soldiers, there to prevent people from getting through. In the course of a night, the lives of many Germans, particularly Berliners, had changed drastically. Families were divided because of Cold War practices and the establishment of the wall. This is especially true for one German family living in the region. Elizabeth and Erna were sisters born in the time of the Second Empire. Elizabeth lived in the west side of Berlin, near Charlottenburg, and Erna lived in the GDR, in Brandenburg, out by Falkensee, about 20 miles from Elizabeth. The Cold War division caused many problems within their family. Erna's husband left the family in 1951 to escape the GDR for the West. Erna's daughter, Eva, only got to see her father 3 times between 1951 and 1990. On top of that, Erna's economic situation in the East had gotten worse since the division. She relied heavily on money sent over by Elizabeth each month coming from West Berlin. When the wall was built, they were 55 and 52, and both had multiple kids. The cousins had seen each other a couple times before the wall went up, but after 1961, they could no longer go and visit each other. These sisters and their families were divided, and the cousins were not able to grow up together. By 1961, both Ava's father and her brother had escaped the GDR for West Germany, leaving just her and her mother alone, divided from their cousins. Ava told interviewers, "We just missed a normal family life." In 1989, when the wall came down, the family was once again reunited. Sisters Elizabeth and Erna were able to see each other, and the cousins, who at this point were adults, saw each other as well. In 1989, Ava of the GDR also got reunited with her father. She remembers him asking her to call him Dad. However, she could not fulfill her father's request to call him by that name. As she said, "It just didn't come out of my mouth." This example of a family divided is just one of many stories that existed throughout Berlin and mainland Germany during the times of heightened Cold War division. Families were divided, and fear and escape played a major role in the everyday lives of East Germans. These experiences provided a new chapter in coping with what it meant to be a German in the late 20th century. When we think about the German border during the Cold War, we often think about the Berlin Wall, which represented a hypersensitive situation due to the isolation of West Berlin. However, the Cold War period also brought about the strengthening and militarization of the interior German border as well. The inner German border was 1,378 kilometers long, with a 1,265 kilometers of metal mesh, 1,185 kilometers of signal fence, 29.1 kilometers of concrete barrier, and 578 observation towers. This military blockade covered the entire stretch of the East German border from the Baltic Sea to Czechoslovakia. The border was monitored by border soldiers who were trained to stop people from fleeing the country. It took roughly 40,000 soldiers from the GDR to watch and maintain this inner border. One of the men interviewed in this program, Lutz, was a border soldier from 1972 to 1973. He said that the government prompted strict discipline, and you had to take orders that they gave you no matter what. He was only 19 at this time. These border troops were being trained to hunt people down and kill when ordered. Instead of demilitarizing Germany after World War II, these borders became highly militarized because of the importance of the territory for the Cold War. These strong borders, like in Berlin, greatly impacted the lives of Germans who lived there. One older gentleman who was interviewed about the militarized border said that for people like him, the border felt like it shouldn't have existed. He had grandparents in Hesse, where he often visited as a kid. That was now Western territory, but it did not feel separate to him. For someone who had grown up under a united Germany, his generation had a hard time acknowledging the drastic changes that split apart families and restricted places where they used to go. On the other hand, when interviewing a younger woman who grew up in East Germany with the border her whole life, there was a different reaction to it. She said that she had a fairly normal childhood and never understood problems with the border. It was all just normal to her. It was always East Germany, and then across the border was a whole different country in the West. It was not until she grew up more that she started to speak out against it. Her grandparents lived in Bavaria, so she never met them growing up. But to her, as a kid, this seemed normal. It was like they were dead or something. In her words, she said, "It's hard to miss something that you never knew existed." These two examples mark another great distinction between the generations of Germans. The younger generation, in the West and East, saw other territories as separate countries. They grew up as East German or West German. They had never known the full Germany of the past. Germany, in their eyes, was radically different from the Germany of the past, and this was a new viewpoint from a divided Cold War Germany that provided new interpretations of what being German meant to this younger generation. It also helped them in redefining a new identity separate from that of the Nazi past.
I was a kid growing up in Holland. We were on vacation in the Harz Mountains, which are on what used to be the border area between East and West Germany. And I had heard some stuff in school about it and stuff like that. I must have been about 12, maybe 13, something like that. I had heard some stuff about, German division and so on, but had never seen the border. And we were hiking in the woods, and I just kind of took off and had a new camera. So I was taking pictures everywhere. Well, there was what turned out to be a military installation on what turned out to be the East-West German border. And I walked towards this thing and started taking pictures. And some German guy, my German was also minimal in those days, apparently yelled across to my parents, "Stop him from taking pictures because we'll shoot." So my parents told me what he had said. So that ended my picture taking for the day, because we were really confronting, this border there.
Reunification was not really on the minds of many people in Western Europe. West Germany had been doing great economically, and it was standing as a strong and independent world power. Britain and France liked the prospects of a permanently divided Germany that meant it would no longer again wage war. However, starting with the collapse of the Soviet bloc around 1989, major protests in the GDR started a movement towards the previously thought impossible prospect of reunification. Protests throughout East Germany became more and more popular as the government lost much of the support that it had previously received due to the Soviets. In 1989, a law was passed that was going to work to reopen the border between the East and West Berlin in response to these major protests. This had been a major talking point because many East Germans sought to find refuge and economic opportunities in the West. On the day that the travel allowance went into effect, thousands and thousands of eager East German citizens overwhelmed the guards who had just received notice of the change. These citizens overtook the wall and essentially tore it down with sheer will. People chipped off sections and flooded through to West Berlin. This breakthrough from the German people led to the start of the long reunification process. The Chancellor of Germany at this time was Helmut Kohl. The first thing Kohl did when he found out about the wall coming down was talk to the four major powers of World War II. The leaders at this time were Bush from the United States, Margaret Thatcher from Great Britain, Mitterrand from France, and Gorbachev from the Soviet Union. The powers all agreed that they had to prevent chaos from breaking out, but this was not a consultation about reunification. After the wall fell, there was a call for Soviet troops to intervene immediately, but it never happened because Gorbachev started seeking closer connections with the West Germany in Bonn. Gorbachev wanted no violence and sent a message to Bonn to negotiate with Kohl. Kohl stated after the falling of the Berlin Wall that the future architecture of Germany must be fitted within the future architecture of Europe as a whole. This would mark the start of a large-scale people's movement that would alter the minds of major powers and allow for a re-established German state. Kohl knew that he would have the support of the US, which sought a stronger ally in reunified Germany, and did not fear the industrial power of the new Germany. Britain, on the other hand, was wholly against the process, and Thatcher fought to prevent it. The other two allies were more indecisive. Gorbachev advocated against it at the start because he had a problem with East Germany getting involved with NATO. France, under Mitterrand, publicly denounced reunification, but secretly supported a lot of Kohl's decisions. After the border between East and West softened, Kohl went to East Germany for the first time. When Kohl arrived in Dresden for the first time to discuss reunification, he arrived to swarms of people shouting, Einheit, 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 and actively vocalizing reunification as the main goal for the citizens. That moment, according to Kohl, was when he realized that he could no longer stop the will of the people, and that he would have to be the one to advocate to convince the four powers on their behalf. The agreements were negotiated under pressure from East German citizens who wanted things to move quickly. The majority of East Germans wanted to join the Federal Republic as a way to better their quality of life, and they were being very vocal about it. One major component of reunification talks was that East Germany was essentially bankrupt. Someone needed to help them, and the Soviets were not in a position to do that. Kohl's main argument to the Soviets was that West Germany would take on the responsibility of rebuilding the East German economy through unification. Gorbachev eventually agreed to these terms, with Kohl also accepting a 4 billion Deutsche Mark loan as a payment to remove soldiers from East Germany. Gorbachev's endorsement was extremely important to the legitimacy of the project because it led to the removal of troops and meant that Kohl had gained support of the two main Allied powers. After the support of Gorbachev came, France quickly followed suit. United Germany meant a stronger overall European economy for the community. The only contingency from France was that Germany adopted a Europe First policy and contributed to the economic betterment of Europe. In the spring of 1990, Europe had agreed to reunification and allowed the new Germany into the European Economic Community.
The main, let's say, idea of Mr. Gorbachev was not to unite Germany. That was a part of his policy. The main idea was, let's have a new relationship to the Western states that will help me to reform the socialist Soviet Union, to help me to reform the socialist Warsaw Pact. That was his idea. He was an open-minded politician, and he made that possible without Mikhail Gorbachev, who said, okay, if the Germans want to unite, it's okay with me. But, you know, he had a lot of troubles with the military, especially the military elite of Soviet Union, who did not want to accept that. But, well, he was the leader, and so he was able to do this. And the second thing is that the United States accepted that term. You know that Great Britain and France were more skeptical about a new German power in the middle, in the center of Europe. But the United States and the President of the United States, Bush, they were convinced, yes, they have turned to democracy. They will become a stable democratic part of Europe. And so the Americans accepted and Gorbachev accepted. And I think that is the most important thing.
After reunification, many major powers were anxious to see what would happen. The last two times Germany was fully united, world wars had sparked, causing massive destruction. However, the new united Germany, under the immediate direction of Helmut Kohl, drew from its recent past of division and denazification to establish a different identity for this new modern state, concentrating on the balance of power and remembrance of its dark past. Germany, after unification, had become the world's first Central European power, and the new Germany took ideas from the East and the West and represented a new and unified Europe. Just a few years after reunification, Germany's GDP was about 1.5 times the size of Great Britain's and a third larger than both France and Italy. It was, however, only half as big as Japan and a third of the US's. Germany's policy after 1990 prioritized the westernization of former Eastern Bloc countries. Germany saw itself as the bridge between East and West and wanted to help it in spreading democracy to its neighbors in the East, as France and Great Britain had done for Germany before. In June of 1991, they voted to move the capital back from Bonn to Berlin as a symbolic decision of cooperation. Germany in the 1990s was also adhering to self-imposed sanctions on its troops. It contributed $6,500 million to the efforts of the Gulf War, but not any troops. It also signed a solemn treaty reaffirming that it would give up atomic, biological, and chemical weapons. By 1993, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin was gaining momentum. It took on a wake of great importance after reunification because it incorporated East Germans into the work of Holocaust guilt, admittance, and reconciliation with the past. It was one of the first public undertakings of the United Germany and put its relationship with its genocidal past at the center of that process. The memorial was completed in 2005 and is now located right at the center of Berlin and is adjacent to many other vital monuments, including the Brandenburg Gate, the Reichstag building, and Hitler's bunker. The new German state has worked tirelessly over the last 30 years to establish itself as a harbinger of peace and balance instead of power and dominance over the continent. With admittance to the EU for United Germany after reunification, Germany has become a spearfront for European economic and social well-being. The extreme division of Germany and occupation during the Cold War helped to shape its new German identity. Western democracy and allies transformed West Germany into a global power once again, but its new alliances helped to push younger generations to create a new role for themselves as Germans in denouncing the Holocaust and incorporating Germanism into the Western world. Division from the Berlin Wall and the interior border changed the perspectives of younger generations. Younger Germans began to see themselves not as a dominant power, but as countries within larger systems, either NATO or the Soviet bloc, and most recently within the European Union. Lastly, German reunification pushed for the reintegration of Germany, but within the context of a state that would maintain these ideals of Western democracy and past remembrance. Germany has become one of the leading advocates of demilitarization and peace within Europe and the world today. And these ideas came out of its own destroyed, divided, and reunified past.